Hello everyone. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Hello, good morning. Can you guys hear me?
Good morning, sir.
Okay, let's just wait for others to join the class. 2 minutes, let's give them 2 minutes to join the class. Okay, we can start with the class. They will find us on the way, those who are still not yet joined the class. Okay, let me just record. Let me check. Yeah, it's recording. Right, so in today's class, we're going to look at joint and byproduct costing. So in joint and byproduct costing, we are, there's someone, let me just admit other people again. Right, so in joint and byproduct costing, what we are looking at is we have a process that is going to produce 2 or more products. So we are trying to find out how are we going to allocate joint cost to those products. Because remember, in a joint process, there are costs incurred before the products become separable, identifiable. So in that case, we can only be able to allocate the cost to the products after the split off point. So which means during the process, we cannot be able to allocate the cost to the products during the process because the process covers all the products. So we can only be able to allocate the cost to the products after the split off point. So that's basically what we'll be looking at in joint and byproduct costing. So which means in a joint and byproduct costing, we are looking at two products which are produced from one process, and the cost incurred before the product become separable, identifiable, should be assigned to the products. So what it means is the joint process will have labor and overheads, raw materials. These are fed into the process. Then the joint process will start to operate. So after the operation of the joint process, we'll have the products at the split off point. So in joint and byproduct costing, we're trying to say this labor and overheads and raw materials which were fed into the process, the cost of this should now be allocated to these products. So in a joint and byproduct costing, we are trying to find ways to allocate the joint cost to the products. So that's basically joint and byproduct costing. Let me just check this other. Okay, let me just admit the other students. Just joined now. Right, so that's basically how we, because if you check here, during the process, you cannot allocate the joint cost to the products. You can only allocate the joint cost to the product after the split off point. This is where you know this is product A, this is product B, this is product C. So now you can be able to allocate the cost now to those joint products. Let me just right. So an example that I can give is, let me give an example of when you are slaughtering a cattle. It's a joint process because in a cattle we have different types of meats that are to come out of the cattle. So you will see that during the process, you will have, after the split off point, you will have the T-bone stick. Then you will have the rump stick. Those who know meat, I think they understand these types of, right. Then you will have the raw hide. So these will be the joint products from the process of slaughtering a cattle. But during the process, you cannot be able to identify these. You can only identify them at split off point. So at split off point, that's when you can now say, I'm going to have the T-bone stick, I'm going to have the rump stick, I'm going to have the raw hide. So the process itself, the cost of the process or the joint cost will now be allocated to these joint products. So that's joint and byproduct costing, which means the process of slaughtering the cattle, the cost of slaughtering the cattle will now be allocated to these joint products. But you'll also see that in the joint products, we have specific products that are intended to be produced. And we have byproducts, and we have waste, and we have scrap. So in that case, you should be able to identify who is a byproduct. The only way you can be able to identify who is a byproduct. A byproduct is incidental in that it's something that come up incidental. You are not intending to come up with that product, but it come incidental. So in your questions, how do you determine that this is a byproduct? Mostly a byproduct will have a very, very low cost. It will have a very low value. So that's how you will determine this is a byproduct in a question. It will have a very, very low value. So in that case, it becomes a byproduct. But let's go through the notes so that we explain some of them. Let's look at the cost accounting treatment of joint products. We have already talked about what a joint product is. We say two or more products produced simultaneously during the joint process and are only distinguishable at the split off point. You can only distinguish them at the split off point. You can't tell in the process which product are there. You only distinguish them at the split off point. And joint products have got a significant sales value, which means they have a sales value that is significant to the organization's operations. Then we have byproducts. Now, in a byproduct, how do you identify that this is a byproduct? A byproduct is produced in a joint process. Sometimes it can be different from original material, so that one becomes a byproduct. It is relatively small in sales value. So in your questions, let's say product A, sales value is 500. Product B, sales value is 700. Product C is 50 Rand. Then automatically you can tell product C is a byproduct. It has a small sales value. So in that case, if the question does not specify that product C is a byproduct, then you should look at the sales value. The sales value will tell you that this is a byproduct. And when we are treating byproducts, we don't allocate joint cost to byproducts as well, which means the joint cost in the process are only going to be allocated to the joint products. Joint products are those products the organization is intending to produce. They are not incidental. This is what we expect. When we slaughter a cattle, we expect to have these two types of meats. So those are going to be the joint products. These other incidental, like the rawhide, will be a byproduct. So what it means now is the labor and overheads and the raw material, which are the joint cost, will now not be allocated to the joint, to the byproduct. So that's another key area that you should look at when you are answering your question. You don't allocate joint cost to byproducts. So how do we treat the joint cost to byproducts? Which means the net sales value after deducting further processing cost is deducted from joint cost. What it means here is when you have your total joint cost, When you have your total joint cost, then you less the net realizable value of byproduct. Please mute yourself as soon as you get into the class. Please, everyone, mute yourself as soon as you get into the class. Right. So I was saying, how do you treat joint costs to byproducts? Which means your sales value of the byproduct is going to reduce the joint cost. So when you are calculating the joint cost to be allocated to joint products, it means you need to have a total cost of the joint cost. When you have a byproduct, the net realizable value comes after further processing. You may find that some of the products in a joint process will be further processed. The reason why we can further process sometimes is because some of the products cannot be used at split off point. Some of them will have a more sales value if they are further processed. So that's why sometimes we have to further process the products after the split off point. So what we call the net realizable value is after we have deducted further processing cost. So if you have a byproduct, which means if the byproduct needs to be further processed, the net realizable value of the byproduct is going to reduce the total joint cost to be allocated to the product. So if the questions ask you to calculate the joint cost to be allocated to joint products, it means you should also take note of the byproduct. The byproduct, you are going to deduct the byproduct, the net realizable value of the byproduct from the joint cost. Then you will have your joint costs allocated to joint products. So that's basically what you should look at when you are calculating the joint cost allocated to joint products, which means you should look at the total joint cost, then the net realizable value of the byproduct will reduce the joint cost. Then the final figure that we have is now going to be joint cost allocated to joint product. I think that's the main area here in your question, because mostly in your question, exam question, test questions, if you are doing a joint cost and byproduct costing, the first step is to calculate joint cost allocated to joint products, which means you should have joint cost allocated to joint products. Once you have the joint cost to be allocated to joint products, then you can now allocate those joint costs to the particular product. So which means in our next step, we'll be looking at how do we allocate. I think we'll look at here, methods of allocating joint costs to joint products, which means once you have your joint costs to be allocated to joint products, the question will tell you which method are you going to use to allocate joint cost to joint products. But let's look at, finish this before we get there. So let's look at scrap. A scrap is raw material left over at the end of the process. They also have a relatively small sales value. We are not also going to allocate joint cost to scrap. Joint costs are not allocated to scrap. Then proceeds on the sale of scrap are deducted from joint cost. So which means the treatment of byproducts and scrap is the same. So in your question, if you have a byproduct or a scrap, then it means you are going to treat them the same. They are not going to be allocated to joint cost, and their proceeds is going to reduce the joint costs that are going to be allocated to the joint product. So you can see byproducts and scrap, we treat them in the same manner. Then waste, these are not going to be used in any way. Waste is going to be dumped. We dump the waste. So there is no joint cost allocated to waste. What is going to happen now is the cost of getting rid of the waste is now going to increase the joint cost allocated to joint product. So in your questions, I want you guys to look at the treatment of byproducts, the treatment of scrap, and the treatment of waste. Once you understand the treatment of byproduct, the treatment of scrap, and the treatment of waste, then it means you can now be able to calculate joint cost allocated to joint products. You will now be able to calculate joint cost allocated to joint products. So which means you should understand how do you treat waste, how do you treat scrap, how do you treat byproduct. So in that case, it means you will be able now to determine the joint costs that are going to be allocated to the joint products. Right, let's look at this activity before we proceed to the next part of the session. Activity 1, they said the company produces 2 products in a joint process, which also yield a byproduct. So here we have 2 products in a joint process, which also yield a byproduct. The following details relate to a normal production run. We have the joint cost. The joint cost, we have direct material, direct labor, and variable overheads, fixed production overheads. Remember, these joint costs are the cost before the split off point. So which means you can only allocate these joint costs to the product after the split off point. Because before the split off point, you don't have the sales value of any one of the product. So which means we can only allocate these joint costs after the split off point. So let's look at the part of the question. They say production at split off point. We have joint product it has 20,000 units. Joint product NAM, byproduct TRAM. You can see here a byproduct will have a very low significant value. So if they did not specify this is a byproduct, you can tell from these values that this is the byproduct. It has a very low significant value. So that's a byproduct. Here we are lucky. The question is specify that this is a byproduct. Then the question says, continue and say, at the split off point, the split off point is the point where the products can be separately identifiable. We can sell at 10 Rand, NAM at 30 Rand. Then tram, who is a byproduct, requires further processing, during which variable costs of 2 Rand per unit are incurred before it can be sold for 3 Rand per unit. So tram is going to be further processed for it to be able to be sold. It needs to be first further processed, and the cost of further processing is 2 Rand per unit, and it's going to be sold for 3 Rand per unit. So here I want you guys now, where we are, we have 2 joint products and a byproduct. So when you look at this question, if you have understood what we have been explaining, you can have a picture of what is going to happen to tram, who is a byproduct, and what is going to happen to the net realizable value of tram, who is a byproduct. Those are the things that you should quickly identify in your question, so that you know how to treat or how to come up to the joint cost. Right. So the first part of the question says, describe the cost accounting treatment of tram. They want us to describe the cost accounting treatment of tram. How are we going to describe the cost accounting treatment of tram? Anyone with any point, how are we going to treat tram? Tram is a byproduct. How are we going to treat the byproduct? Tram is a byproduct. So how are we going to treat tram? Anyone with an idea?
I think we need to separate the.
Hello? You can speak up.
I think we need to get the net
Sorry?
You need to separate. You need to.
Your network, I think, is cutting. Can you try to speak up?
I think we need to get the net realizable value for tram, and then separate it from the total joint cost.
So what we can say is we're going to say the net realizable value of tram, the net realizable value of tram will reduce joint cost. allocated to joint products. Right? What else can we say about TRAM? Anyone with an idea of what else can we say about TRAM? Then we can also say that TRAM will not be allocated joint cost. What else can we say about TRAM? Not Trump, sorry. So I think that's all. So when we have a byproduct like TRAM, it means the net realizable value will be used to reduce the joint cost allocated to the joint product. And also the treatment of TRAM is we are not going to allocate joint cost to TRAM. Anyone who has anything to add there? I think that's all. Let's just go to a byproduct. So which means we are here. These are the 2 points that we should check. Joint costs are not allocated to byproducts. The net sales value after deducting further processing costs is deducted from the joint cost to arrive at the joint cost allocated to the joint product. Right, so let's look at the other part of the question. The other part of the question says calculate the total joint cost to be allocated to joint products. The total joint cost to be allocated to joint products. Who can summarize in short, how are we going to calculate the total joint cost to be allocated to joint products? Like we are here, this is the question. These are the joint costs. These are the joint costs, and these are the joint products. How are we going to calculate the joint cost to be allocated to the joint products? Anyone who can just briefly explain how are we going to calculate the joint cost to be allocated to the joint products? From what we have here, I'm not saying you should calculate, just explain how are we going to calculate the joint cost to be allocated to the joint products. We have joint cost and our joint products here. So how do we arrive at the joint cost that has to be allocated to the joint product? Anyone who can briefly explain the process of arriving at the joint cost to be allocated to the joint products?
Can you hear me now?
Push voice, push the voice.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Push again.
I think we need to calculate the net realizable value for TRAM there. So we've got, I think we've got how many units there? 500.
Yes.
Then we multiply by the number, the amount is sold by 3 rands a unit. And
then after that, what are we going to do? When we have the net realizable value of TRAM?
Yeah, we need also to subtract it from the joint cost, total joint cost. Okay. And then after that, we'll figure out which type of allocation are we supposed to use. If we are using the net realizable value, then we use net realizable value. Then if it is about using the amount of products that is being produced, to use that one.
Okay, yeah, but the question is, I think you have gone much further. The question requires us to calculate the total joint cost. Total joint cost, which means we just need the joint costs that are going to be allocated. We are not allocating yet. We only need the joint costs that are going to be allocated, which means what you have said in your point 1 and 2 is exactly what we are supposed to do. So when you are doing this, then you come and say your total joint cost. Our total joint cost is 300, 500. That's our total joint cost is 300. Then you less net realizable value of TRAM. You less the net realizable value of TRAM. How do we determine the net realizable value of? Remember, the net realizable value is after deducting further processing cost. So, which means we have 3 rand per unit times 500. That's the sales value. Then the net realizable, we are going to deduct 500 times further processing cost. So which means
Sorry, sir.
Yes.
Can Smile please mute himself because it's disturbing.
Smile, you hear your. I think there's a bit of a sound on your. I don't know what is it. Yeah, I can hear it here.
Thank you.
So what we are going to do is we are going to less the net realizable value of TRAM. The net realizable value is after you deduct further processing cost, which means we are going to deduct this variable cost of 2 rand. Then we have our net realizable value. So which means it's going to be 500 times 3 rand minus 500 times 2. That is going to be the net realizable value of TRAM. So how much is going to be the net realizable value of TRAM? Here we have 1,500. Here we have 1,000. So it's going to be 500. Am I right?
Yes.
It's 500. So joint costs to be allocated to joint products. So which means we're just going to subtract 500 from here. So the joint cost to be allocated to joint products is going to be 300,000. Right, so that will be your first step in your questions, which means you need to determine the joint cost to be allocated to the joint product. So in determining the joint cost to be allocated to joint product, it means you need to deduct the net realizable value of a byproduct or a scrap. Remember, the treatment of a byproduct and a scrap is the same. So which means if you have one of them or all of them, you need to deduct the net realizable value of the two so that you arrive at the joint costs that are going to be allocated to the joint products. Right. In your questions, once you have your joint costs to be allocated to the joint product, now you can be able to allocate joint costs to joint product using the allocation method that is specified in the question. So that's basically how we, so which means the first step, you cannot allocate something that you cannot start by allocating because you don't know the joint costs that are going to be allocated to the joint product. So which means you need to come up with the joint cost to be allocated to the joint products. Then once you have the joint cost now, you can now allocate. Before we look at the allocation methods, anyone with a question before we get to the allocation method? Is there anyone with a question with what we have done so far?
Sir,
Yes.
I just wanted to find out if we are not given the what's that the byproduct costing, like here that you've mentioned that what's that tram is the byproduct for that spilled point. Do we have to calculate for all to check if the sales, to check which one will be the lowest sales, and then calculate the net realization value? I wanted to find out if we are not given the byproduct term, no, the byproduct, do we calculate it? Do we calculate it for all those products to see which one is the lowest,
You
so
can,
that subtract from?
okay, let me just answer you there. It's easy to see who is a byproduct. Remember, we say a byproduct has got a very low sales value. By looking at the units here, you can tell that tram is a byproduct as compared to here. So which means even before you calculate anything, you can tell this is a byproduct by looking even at the units. Before you even calculate the sales value, you can tell this is a byproduct. From 20,000, 10,500, which means this one is something that came incidentally. It's not something that they are intending to produce. So if the question does not give you or does not specify the byproduct, you look at the production or the sales value. But in most cases, they will give you the quantities that are produced. And if it is the lowest, the one with the lowest is a byproduct in a question. I don't know if any other question before we go to, if there is anyone with another question. But in most of your questions, they always specify a byproduct. But you should always be careful how to identify a byproduct. A byproduct is a very low sales value. Right. Any other question before we go to methods of allocating joint costs to joint products?
Sorry, sir.
Yes.
I think you should also explain and how do we treat scrap and waste, because I think they also, if they are there in the question, they also affect there on that joint cost.
Can you speak up? I can't get the question.
I'm saying I think you do. Do we treat scrap and waste for in case they are there in the question?
Okay. What he's asking is saying, how do we treat scrap and waste? Remember, scrap, you treat it the same way as a byproduct. If we had scrap here, it means we're going to less it to arrive at joint cost. So which means, let's say this one is a byproduct. tram is a byproduct. If we had scrap, it means also we need to less the scrap. If it has been further processed, it means you need to determine the net realizable value of that scrap. But if it was sold before being further processed, then you can check the full figure. So which means the scrap, you are also going to deduct it. Then the waste, you add the cost of disposing that waste. The waste, no one is going to be worried about determining the value of the waste. So which means once it's a waste, then it means no one is going to determine the value of the waste. But what we do on the waste is we are going to look at the cost of dumping. The cost of dumping the waste is what you are going to add. So which means the waste, the cost of dumping the waste is going to increase the joint costs allocated to joint products. So that's basically how you arrive at joint costs allocated to joint products if you have waste, scrap, and the byproduct. So in the waste, you look in the question, you look at the cost of dumping the waste. So that cost of dumping the waste is going to increase the joint cost. You see now, waste is opposite from the byproduct and the scrap. Byproduct and scrap, they are going to be sold. So they reduce the joint costs that are going to be allocated to the joint product. But the waste, nothing comes out of the waste. It's a cost that is not going to be recoverable. So it's going to increase the joint cost to be allocated to the joint product. I don't know if it's clear now.
Green tea.
Is it clear now? Where is the guy who asked the question? Right. So any other question before we proceed to methods of allocating joint cost to joint products? If there is.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yes.
I'll ask something. Let's say the net realizable value of byproduct or scrap. Okay, we sold at a loss. Let's say we sold by R2. The cost, the further cost is R3. It's now a negative R1. It's realizable value.
Yeah.
It means it's a
loss.
negative 500. So we add it to the cost.
Yeah, if it is a negative net realizable value, then it means it's going to increase the cost.
Okay.
Yeah, so in your question, if you come up with a negative net realizable value, the cost of further processing, but in most of the, remember in that one is fine, the question is fine, it brings up something, but in most cases, remember here, the organization is trying to make money out of the byproduct or the scrap. So in a situation where they find that the cost of further processing is more than the sales value, they will take it as a waste. In that case, they will not sell that, but they will look into, because they will look into, but into they will take into account how it is going to reduce their joint cost. So in that case, if the organization come up with a negative, so it means that small or negative is going to increase the joint cost. It is going to be an advantage for them even to sell if there is a negative, because sometimes you find that if they are not going to sell that scrap, then it means it's going to increase more. So which means if they sell, then it means the joint cost allocated to joint products will be increased with a less figure, with that difference, right? Any other question before we go to the methods of allocating the joint cost to joint products? Anyone with another question? Right, so let's look at methods of allocating. So once you have your, like now, we now have our joint cost allocated to joint products. So now we want to allocate those joint costs to joint products. How do we allocate? In your question, you will be provided with the method. So you should always look out for the method in the question. Which method does the question specify as the allocating method? Yes, you can ask. I see a hand there. Joe, you can ask the question.
Okay, sorry sir, it's not about the question. Can you please request Uncle Gizo to mute himself, please? Because sometimes he's disturbing the class.
Yes, thank you. I fully agree.
Yeah, please mute. You guys, you must always mute yourself, unmute yourself when you answer a question or ask a question. Everyone must mute themselves, because I don't want to mute you because you won't be able to communicate with me. So the reason why we say mute yourself and unmute yourself is because it's a class. We want to have interaction. So in that case, please always try your best to behave when you join the class. Right, I think they are going to mute themselves. Right, so let's look at the methods of allocating joint costs to joint products. So I was saying in a question, the process of answering your question is the first part you need now to have the joint cost allocated to joint products, which means you should come up with the joint cost allocated to joint product. When you have the joint cost allocated to joint products, then now you need now to allocate joint cost to joint products. Remember, in most of our question, we'll have two products, product A and product B. Right. So now we want to allocate this joint cost to these joint products. How do we allocate? We have the physical measure. Physical measure is all about quantity. Like in our case, it means when we allocate using the physical measure, we are going to use here. These are the joint products. Remember, we say a byproduct is not going to be allocated joint cost. So which means we have these two joint products. We are now going to allocate using the physical measures, the output, which means we are going to have 20 and 30, 20 and 10. So it's going to be for arm, it's going to be 20,000 over 30,000. Then for NAM, it's going to be 10,000 over 30,000. So that's how you allocate, multiply by the joint cost. That's how you are going to allocate using the physical measures. So always be on the lookout in the question, which method are you going to use to allocate joint cost to joint product? Then let's look at the market value at split off point. When you use the market value at split off point, it means you are going to allocate using the estimated sales value of the joint products at the point where they become separately identifiable. So which means here, when you come here, the market value are going to be for 20,000 times 10 is for then for NAM is 10,000 times 30. These are the market value at split off point. So that's how you are going to, is it market value? Is net real? Yeah, it's market value, okay. So which means you are going to multiply by the sales per unit. That's the market value at split off point. Then you allocate joint cost the same way here, which means your total market value is going to be your denominator, your market value for your numerator, then you allocate the joint cost to the joint product. Right, then let's look at another method, the net realizable value. Once a product, some of the products might require further processing. So which means if a product requires further processing, then you are now going to allocate using the net realizable value. So which means the net realizable value is after you deduct further processing cost. So that is going to be the net realizable value. So which means if the question requires you to allocate using the net realizable value, it means you need to deduct further processing cost. Then you get the net realizable value for each product. Then you allocate based on the net realizable value. It's still the same, but here now your total is going to be your denominator. Then your net realizable value of each product, then multiply by the joint cost. So that's basically how you allocate using the net realizable value, which means you need to look at the further processing cost. Then you deduct them from the sales value. Then you have your net realizable value. Then you allocate based on that. Then there is also the constant gross profit percentage. When you use the constant gross profit percentage, you are going to calculate a constant gross profit, which means one gross profit for all the products. How do you calculate the one gross profit for all the products? It means you have the total. Let me just, for this one, let me just try to give from the question. Right. So when we are here, but there are no costs here. Right, when you are using the constant gross profit, it means you need the total sales minus total cost. Then you are going to have your gross profit. Then you express that gross profit as a percentage. So when you express that gross profit as a percentage now, then it means you can now be able to determine the gross profit for each product based on the percentage that you got for all, then you will have the gross profit for each product. From the gross profit of each product, you are now going to calculate the difference between the sales value. Is now going to represent what? The total cost, which means your sales value from minus the gross profit. So your gross profit for each, your gross profit, your sales minus the gross profit is now going to be the total cost, which means the total cost is going to be the joint cost that is going to be allocated to that particular product. So here it means you are going to have the sales value for each product, then you deduct the gross profit. Then in that case, you are now going to have the total joint costs that are allocated to that particular product. So that's the constant gross profit percentage. I think let's demonstrate using activity 2. Let's use activity 2 to demonstrate this. They say using the same information given in activity 1, calculate the cost of each joint product using the following methods to allocate joint cost. They want us to calculate the cost of each joint product using the following methods to allocate joint cost. The first one is the physical measure. We want to calculate the joint cost to be allocated to joint products using the physical measure. We're going to use this information. Where do we start? We want to allocate the joint cost to joint products using the physical measures. Anyone who can explain where do we start?
I think we need to add 20,000 plus 10,000, and then we get the total. After getting the total, then we need to take 20,000 over multiply it by the joint cost.
Yes. So we want to use the physical measures. So if we are using the physical measures, we come here, and these are the physical measures. Remember, the physical measures are the quantities. We have 20 and 10,000. Then we come to our joint cost. You no longer allocate these ones. You allocate the one that you have calculated. Those are the joint costs allocated to joint product. So which means we are now going to allocate 300,000 using the physical measures. So it's going to be for arm, we have arm, and who else? We have num. We want to allocate the joint cost. So it's going to be for arm, it's going to be, arm is the one with 20,000, it's going to be 20,000 over 30,000 times 300,000. Then for num, it's going to be 10,000 over 30,000 times 300,000. How much are we going to have for arm, anyone who got the one for arm? $20,000 divided by 30.
I'm getting 200.
200,000.
So arm is going to have 200,000. Then once you have for arm, then there's nothing to calculate. Then NAM is going to have 100,000. So that's how you allocate using the physical measure. Then let's look at another the other part. They want us to allocate using the market value at split off point. We are going to allocate using the market value at split off point. How do we allocate using the market value at split off point, which means split off point is where the products separate, can be identified. This is arm, this is NAM, this is tram. So that's the split off point. So they say at the split off point, arm can be sold at 10 Rand and NAM at 30 Rand. So these are the market values at split off point. So we want to allocate the joint cost using the market values at split off point, which means these are the market values at split off point. So which means we are going to say when we allocate using, so our number 2 is going to be market values so which means market values, so which means the first thing is to determine the market value. Let's first have the market value for arm. Arm is 20,000. Arm is selling at 10 Rand, so it's going to be 20,000 times 10. Am I right? It's 10 Rand for arm. Then for NAM, NAM is 10,000 times 30. These are the market values. Market values. So what is going to be the market value for this one is going to be 200,000. 200,000. Then the market value for NAM is going to be 300,000. Am I right?
Yes.
Right. So when we allocate using the market values, then it means for arm, it's going to be 200,000 over 500,000 times 300,000. Then for NAM, it's going to be 300,000 over 500,000 times the 300,000. 300,000 is the joint cost, right? So which means that's how we are going to allocate. So how much are we going to have for each using the market values, which means we just here is going to be 2/5. Just use 2/5. 2 divided by 5 times 300,000. So this one is going to have 120.
120,000.
And this one, 300,000 minus 120 is going to be how much? 180, am I right?
Yes.
Yes.
So this one is going to be 180,000. So that's how you allocate. So you can see there is nothing much. Like I always say, in MAC, the most important thing is to know the format of how to answer a question. Once you know the format of answering a question and the topic, because remember in our questions, exam questions, test questions, the question will be integrated. All the topics will be on one or on 2 pages. So what is important for you guys is to first master all the topics from topic 1 to the last topic, know them and how to treat them. So that the moment you start reading the scenario, you already have you already know. If you read a scenario talking about joint cost, byproducts, split off point, automatically you know this is to do with joint and byproduct costing. So if the question now asks you how to allocate joint costs to joint products, you know the process of doing it, which means it's not going to be difficult for you to extract the figures from the scenario. The problem comes if you don't understand the topics. That's when people will now say HMAC is complicated because there's a lot of information. That information, as long as you know what you want from that information, it's not going to be difficult for you to extract what you want and leave what you don't want. The problem comes if you don't know what you want. Then you'll be looking at everything. You trying everything because you don't know exactly what you want. So what I'm saying is always make sure that the first step in your make is to understand all the topics so that you can be able to extract information from the scenario for a specific topic which you are going to answer. If you do like that, you will tell me by October that make is very doable because the topics are the only thing. What they did, they just put everything together. But you will see, the moment you read, you can see this topic, this is topic, which one? This is this topic, this is this topic. So which means if the question asks about it, then you know how to do that topic. You are going to follow the procedure for answering that particular topic. Right. So that's there. So this was market values at split off point. Right. So let's look at another allocating method. Oh, where are they? They say number 3. They say the net realizable value, assuming that further processing of arm into SAM occurs at 6 Rand per unit. The selling price for SAM, do you see here, arm has been further processed to SAM, and the further processing cost is 6 Rand per unit. The selling price is 18 Rand per unit. You see, the selling price has changed after further processing. At first, it was at first the selling price was 10 rand.
10 rand.
So now after further processing, it's now 18 rand. So they want us now to allocate the joint cost to the joint products using the net realizable value. Using the net realizable value. Where do we start? On number 3, where do we start? The joint costs are still the same. The joint costs to be allocated to the product are still the same. But what we want here is the net realizable value.
Realizable value.
Where do we start? Anyone with an idea, where do we start here? Yes.
I think we start by calculating the net realizable value of sum and the net realizable value of AM. Then after we get the total of net realizable value, then we separate using the net realizable value.
Yes, that's 100% correct. We need the net realized. Once the question says use the net realizable value to allocate joint cost, the first thing is to calculate your net realizable value of each product. Once you have the net realizable value, then you are going to use that net realizable value to allocate the joint cost to the joint products. Right. So which means let's calculate the net realizable value. ARM was converted to sum at 6 rand per unit variable cost. The selling price per unit of sum is 18 rand. So let's start by calculating the net realizable value. Net realizable value of sum. Let's start by sum. Right, sum is the one with sum is the one that was converted to ARM. It was ARM, sorry. So which means we are left with NUM. So we need now to calculate the net realizable value. So your net realizable value is going to be the sales value less further processing cost. Am I right? So the sales value of ARM, which was converted to sum, is going to be 20,000 times 18. Then the further processing cost is 6 times 20,000. So how much are we going to have as the sales value?
360,000.
360,000.
Yes.
Yes.
360,000 is the sales value minus the further processing cost. It's 6 times 20.
120,000. 120.
120,000. So our net realizable value is going to be 40 here. It's 240,000. Am I right? Am I correct? Right. So that is going to be the net
Yes.
realizable value of sum. So that's our calculation number 1. Then our calculation number 2, we want to do the net realizable value of NUM. Was NUM further processed in the question? Do we have any further processing of NUM?
No.
So if there is no
Mm.
further processing, we just took the sales value at split off point for NUM, which means we're going to use the sales value at split off point. So NUM at split off point was 30 times 10,000. So that's the sales value of NUM. So we need the sales value of NUM. NUM was not further processed, so we're going to use the sales value, which is going to be 30 times 10,000, which is going to be 300,000. So this is going to be the sales value for NUM. Then when you have this, but we made a bit of a small mistake here. When you are answering your questions, calculations should come below your answer. So which means these calculations for net realizable values should come below your answer. You don't have to put the calculations on top of the answer. But for us now, that's what we did. So which means the next thing that we are now going to do is to have the joint cost allocated to joint products. So we are going to have who is this one? This one is NUM and SUM. So we are having SUM and NUM. Right. So these are the two products. So we want to allocate. Now here there's nothing. You can see there's nothing much. You have calculated your joint cost to be allocated to the joint products. Now you use the given method of allocating the joint cost to the product. So which means in our case here, we are using the net realizable value. We now have our net realizable values. We are going to add them. They give us 540, which means for SUM it's going to be 240 over 540. Then for here is 300 over 540. So for SUM it's going to be 240,000 over 540 times 300,000. Then for NUM it's going to be 300,000 over 540 times 300,000. So when you have a net realizable value allocation method, the only thing that you need to calculate is the net realizable value. Once you have the net realizable value, the joint cost, remember I said the first thing is the joint cost. You need to have which are the joint costs that I'm going to allocate to the joint product. Once you have the joint cost, in a question, they will tell you which method are you going to use to allocate the joint cost to the joint product? Then you use that method to allocate the joint cost to the joint product. So which means it is very important for you to look at the method, because you don't use any method in the question. You are going to be given the method that you are going to use to allocate the joint cost to the joint product. Right, how much are we going to have which goes to sum? It's just a simple calculation there, 240 divided by 540 times 300. How much? Who got the answer now? Anyone who got the answer? I'm getting something.
It's 133,333.
So we are going to allocate 133,333 to sum. Then the difference is now going to be allocated to num. So we are just going to subtract 300,000 minus 133,333. So here we are going to have 166,667. So this is how we are going to allocate. So when you are answering your question, the first thing is to calculate your joint cost. The joint cost allocated to joint products. Right. In your joint cost, you will be provided with the cost of the process, which means once you have the cost of the process, you need now to determine if there is a byproduct, how to treat a byproduct, how to treat scrap, and how to treat the waste. So these are the adjustments to the joint cost, to the process cost. So which means the process cost, you need to adjust with the byproduct and the scrap and the waste to come up with the joint cost allocated to the product. So once you have your joint cost allocated to the product, then it means the last thing is to allocate joint cost to product using the method provided in the question. The question will tell you which method to use. Right. So that's all, and that's all about joint cost. So in summary, I can say when you are answering your question on joint cost, just be careful on how to treat the byproduct, how to treat the scrap, how to treat the waste. I think that's the only area which can complicate your answering of the question. So once you know how to treat them, then you now have your joint costs that are going to be allocated to the joint product. Once you get the joint costs, then it means you can now be able to allocate the joint cost to the joint products using the method that is provided in the question. Right, so I think that's all what we have for today's class. What I want us, you guys, unless if there is a question, I want us to